The observation deck stretched far into the distance, and Captain Daniel Hayes stood before 43 alien species who had gathered to judge humanity and decide if Earth deserved a place among the stars, and the walls were made of clear material that showed the swirling colors of a distant nebula outside, and Daniel wore his best uniform, though it felt heavy after the long journey through space that had brought them here, and beside him stood Ambassador Helen Foster, whose gray hair was pulled back tight and whose face showed no emotion. Though Daniel knew she carried the weight of 8 billion human lives on her shoulders, and they both knew this moment would decide everything for their species. The Kryn ambassador rose from his seat, and his name was Kreth, and he was massive and towering 3 meters tall with a body that looked like it was carved from living stone, and his silicon-based form gleamed under the artificial lights of the station, and when he spoke his voice sounded like rocks grinding together, and he asked if humans really wanted to join the Galactic Council, and his tone suggested he already knew the answer would disappoint him. Helen stepped forward, and her voice was calm and steady, as she explained that Earth had achieved faster-than-light travel, and had established 3 colony worlds, and had proven their commitment to peace and cooperation with other species, and she spoke with confidence, though Daniel could see her hands were shaking slightly at her sides. Then the chamber filled with sounds that Daniel realized after a moment was laughter, and it rippled through the assembled aliens like a wave, and he felt heat rising in his face but kept his expression neutral. A Vesh delegate spoke next, and their body was translucent and pulsed with colors that seemed to show amusement, and they asked how many humans had died just leaving their own planet, and Helen tried to explain that early space programs had casualties, but they had learned from those mistakes and improved their technology, but the Vesh interrupted her. Kreth gestured, and a holographic display appeared floating in the center of the chamber, and it showed a human skeleton rotating slowly in the air, and nearly every bone was marked with red indicators showing points of weakness and vulnerability, and Daniel stared at the image of his own species laid bare for all to see. Kreth explained that human skeletons were made of calcium phosphate, and he said the word calcium with something like disgust, and pointed out that it was one of the softest structural materials known to biology in the entire galaxy. A Tolmar observer spoke, and their ancient eyes studied the humans with cold scientific interest, and they noted that the human femur could fracture from a fall of less than 2 meters, and that human ribs could crack from simple compression, and that human vertebrae would degenerate from just standing upright on their own world. And each fact was stated cleanly, like reading from a medical report. Daniel felt the weight of every word, and knew that everything being said was true, and humans were fragile compared to these species who had evolved on harsher worlds with stronger gravity and more dangerous environments. Helen argued that human biology had adapted to Earth-specific conditions, and that intelligence and technology and culture were what humanity offered to the galactic community, and her voice remained steady despite the dismissal she faced. Kreth laughed again, and the sound filled the chamber like an avalanche, and he asked what culture humans could possibly offer when they had been a spacefaring species for less than a century, while the Kryn had sailed between stars for 12,000 years, and the Vesh for 30,000 years. Lieutenant Claire Morrison, who was the chief medical officer, stepped forward and spoke up, though Daniel could see she was nervous with all the attention suddenly focused on her, and she said that humans might be physically fragile, but they had survived, and Earth had faced 5 mass extinctions and climate upheavals and diseases that killed millions. And yet here they stood before the council. The Tolmar elder responded by noting that humans stood on a station where the gravity was adjusted to 0.6 Earth normal to accommodate their weakness, and where the atmosphere was enriched because human lungs could not efficiently process standard station air, and where the furniture had been modified because human spines could not tolerate proper seating, and every accommodation that had been made for human comfort was now being used as evidence of their inadequacy. Kreth announced that the council's decision was unanimous, and humanity was not ready for full membership, and they could maintain observer status and continue their colonial efforts within their designated sector, but they would not have voting rights or military protection or access to advanced technologies until they proved they could survive in the galaxy as it existed, and not as they wished it to be. The words hung in the air like a sentence of death, and Helen's face remained calm. But Daniel saw her hands trembling, and he felt anger building in his chest at the dismissal and the mockery. Daniel asked how humanity could prove themselves, and His voice carried across the chamber and cut through the murmurs of the alien delegates. The Tolmar elder looked at him with what might have been curiosity, and said simply that humans should survive, and nothing more was needed than that simple instruction. 3 weeks passed, and the colony ship Wanderer departed from the Council Station with its cargo holds filled with supplies for humanity's fourth colony world, and Daniel stood on the bridge watching the station grow smaller in the view screen. And beside him, Commander Lucas Grant spoke quietly about how the aliens thought humans were made of glass. Daniel replied quietly that maybe humans were made of glass compared to species with silicon bones and chitinous armor. Claire observed from her station that glass could cut, and that humans had always been good at making weapons from whatever materials they had available. Daniel glanced at her and saw the determination in her eyes that he had witnessed in countless humans throughout his career, and recognized that stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had driven humanity from caves to the stars and across oceans and up mountains, despite every physical limitation. He ordered the crew to set course for Haven Colony and asked someone to find Jake Patterson, the young engineer, who had been working on modifications to the full drive, and Lucas warned that those modifications had not been approved by Council standards. Daniel pointed out that the Council had made it clear humans were not under their protection, which meant they were not bound by Council standards either, and they would do things the human way now. The Wanderer's engines flared bright, and the ship jumped into fold space, leaving the mockery and dismissal of the Galactic Council behind, and none of them knew that in 37 hours they would encounter the Zeks, and the galaxy would get its first real look at what human fragility truly meant when combined with human determination. In the engineering bay, Jake Patterson whistled while he worked on the full drive modifications, and his young face was smudged with grease and oil, and he was completely unaware that he was about to become the first human to show the galaxy that bones might break easily, but the will that carried them forward could prove unbreakable, and that fragility was not the same thing as weakness, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the universe was not the strongest creature, but the one that refused to quit no matter how much damage it took. The Zeks' attack came without any warning at all, and one moment the Wanderer was cruising peacefully through the outer reaches of the Haven system, with sensors showing nothing but empty space and distant asteroids, and the next moment reality itself seemed to tear open and 3 Zeks raiders materialized in perfect attack formation, and their ships were dark and angular and looked like insects made of metal. Daniel shouted for evasive maneuvers and gripped his command chair as the ship lurched sideways, and the bridge exploded into chaos with alarms shrieking and holographic displays flashing red warnings, and the deck plates shuddered violently as the first energy burst struck the Wanderer's shields. Lucas reported from Tactical that shields were down to 60% already, and the Zeks were using some kind of phased plasma weapon, and the shields had not been designed to handle this frequency of energy. Daniel ordered them to return fire and target the propulsion systems, and the Wanderer's defensive batteries opened up with streams of kinetic projectiles and focused energy beams that lanced toward the Zeks' ships. But the insectoid vessels moved with terrifying agility and twisted in ways that no human-designed ship could match. Claire's console exploded in a shower of sparks and threw her backward, and she hit the deck hard, and Daniel heard the sickening crack of breaking bone even over the noise of battle, and the sound made his stomach turn. He called for a medical team to get to the bridge, but he knew the medical bay was 3 decks down, and they were in the middle of a fight for their lives. A second Zeks energy burst penetrated their weakening shields and struck the engineering section directly, and the ship's artificial gravity flickered, and suddenly Daniel was floating with only his chair's restraint harness holding him in place. Lucas confirmed that gravity generators were offline, and there were multiple hull breaches on decks 7 through 9, and emergency bulkheads were sealing automatically, but they had people trapped in those sections. Someone called out that Jake Patterson had been in engineering bay 2, and that was deck 8, and deck 8 had taken a direct hit. Daniel felt his blood run cold because deck 8 had lost atmosphere and no one could survive that. The battle continued for 17 more minutes, and each second felt like an hour of fire and fear, and the Wanderer's crew fought with everything they had, but they were outgunned and outmaneuvered, and only the fact that the Zeks seemed unfamiliar with human weapons kept them alive at all. Finally, the Zeks withdrew and their ships vanished into fold space as suddenly as they had appeared, and they had gotten what they came for, which was scanning data on human vessels and combat capabilities, and a clear understanding of human vulnerabilities. The Wanderer drifted in space wounded and broken, and Daniel unstrapped himself and pushed off toward Claire, who was conscious but pale with her right arm bent at an angle that arms should not bend. He told her not to move, and that help was coming. But Claire was a medical officer, and her training overrode the pain, and she said her radius was fractured, and it was a clean break but displaced, and she needed immobilization, and then she stopped, and her eyes went wide, and she told him to get to Jake. Lucas was already coordinating rescue efforts and reported that teams were cutting through the bulkheads now. But Deck 8 had lost atmosphere for approximately 4 minutes before emergency seals engaged. 4 minutes without air was a death sentence, and Daniel felt sick knowing that Jake was gone. But he had forgotten that humans had always been good at surviving the impossible. When the rescue team finally cut through to Engineering Bay 2, they found Jake Patterson pinned beneath a collapsed support beam, and his left leg was crushed, and his helmet was cracked and blood was frozen on his face from a dozen cuts, but he was conscious and his eyes were open. He spoke through the emergency respirator that someone had clamped over his face and told Daniel that he thought he had found a problem with the gravity generator, and he was making a joke while trapped and dying. The rescue team stared in shock, because the support beam across his legs weighed nearly 300 kilograms, and his suit's medical readouts showed 3 fractured ribs and a collapsed lung and a shattered femur and a fractured pelvis and a severe concussion, and by all logic, he should have been dead. Daniel ordered them to get Jake to medical and to be very careful, and the evacuation took 2 hours because moving him was extremely dangerous. Jake screamed when they lifted the beam, and his body went into shock despite the painkillers they had pumped into him, and his shattered femur had pierced through the skin and white bone was visible through torn flesh and fabric. In the medical bay, Claire worked with one hand and directed the medical staff with calm precision despite her own injury, and she told them to get Jake into the trauma pod immediately because they needed to stabilize that femur before they could even think about surgery. One of the nurses protested that Claire needed treatment too, but Claire said firmly that Jake was critical, and she was just broken, and Jake came first. The medical team worked for 6 hours straight, and they rebuilt Jake's shattered leg with titanium, rods and bone grafts, and reinflated his collapsed lung and repaired internal bleeding, and treated his concussion. And the surgery would have been impossible without human medical technology that had been refined over centuries of treating a species that injured itself constantly. 3 days later, Jake woke up in a private recovery room with full gravity restored, and his leg was immobilized in a regeneration cast, and tubes and monitors covered his battered body. Daniel was sitting beside his bed when he opened his eyes. Daniel told him without any introduction that they had sent a report to the Galactic Council and included full medical scans of his injuries and recovery. Jake tried to laugh, but it came out as a cough, and he said he bet the council loved that, and probably used it as more proof of how fragile humans were. Daniel pulled up a holographic display and showed him the message from the council, and it was translated into English, and Daniel read it aloud, and the message said that human specimen Jake Patterson sustained injuries that would have resulted in immediate death for any Kryn or Vesh or Tolmar individual, and the trauma to his skeletal and pulmonary systems should have caused cascade organ failure. But he remained conscious and coherent, and was expected to make a full recovery. And they requested an explanation of this discrepancy. Jake stared at the message and then at Daniel and asked what they had told the council in response. Daniel replied that he told them the truth, which was that yes, humans break easily, but humans have spent their entire evolutionary history breaking and healing over and over, and human bodies know how to survive trauma, because they have been surviving it since they climbed down from the trees millions of years ago. Jake spoke slowly as understanding dawned in his eyes and said that humans were not strong, but they were tough, and there was a difference between those two things. Daniel agreed that there was a difference, and the galaxy was about to learn what that difference meant in practical terms. Across the ship, Claire Morrison was having her arm placed in a regeneration cast, and she refused the sedatives that would have made her comfortable because she wanted to be alert and ready for whatever came next. She knew the Zheks would be back, and next time humanity would be ready for them too. In the depths of space, the Zheks fleet commanders reviewed the battle data from their raid on the Wanderer, and they had expected an easy victory against the fragile humans. But instead, they had found a species that refused to die, even when by all logic they should have. One Jex commander, who was a seasoned veteran of 100 conquests, studied the footage of Jake Patterson trapped and broken, yet still conscious and still making jokes. The commander said to its subordinates that humans were weak, but weakness that refused to yield was more dangerous than strength that could break. It was a lesson the Jex would learn fully in the coming months and one the galaxy would never forget. 6 weeks after the attack on the Wanderer, Captain Daniel Hayes stood in a war room that had not existed a month ago, and the walls of the converted cargo bay were covered with tactical displays and star charts and intelligence reports on Jex. Movements throughout the sector and the room hummed with activity as crew members analyzed data and planned strategies. Lucas Grant reported that the Jex had hit 3 more human outposts in the last 2 weeks, and they were small raids mostly, and the Jex were probing defenses and learning human patterns and trying to find weaknesses. Claire Morrison added that the Jex were also learning that humans did not fight like anyone else, and she highlighted the casualty ratios on the display and pointed out that in traditional Galactic Council, warfare combat casualties rarely exceeded 10% before forces withdrew because species with durable bodies did not risk damage when retreat was an option. Human casualties in the recent engagements averaged 37%, but the Jex casualties were higher, and that fact hung in the air like a challenge. Daniel said quietly that humans did not retreat, and the Jex were not used to that. Jake Patterson spoke up from his position near the engineering displays, and he was walking with a cane now, and his leg was still healing, but he had refused to remain in medical, and he said he had been analyzing Jex tactics, and the Jex were predictable, because they assumed everyone valued self-preservation above objectives. He pulled up footage from the most recent raid on Research Station Kepler, and the Jex had attacked with overwhelming force, and expected the human defenders to evacuate, but instead, the station's small security team had fought from entrenched positions and used the station's infrastructure as weapons. Jake indicated a sequence where a human engineer deliberately collapsed a corridor onto a Jex boarding party and trapped herself in the process, and she survived because she was wearing a hard suit, but she could not have known for certain she would make it, and she just knew it would stop the Jex advance. The room fell silent as they watched the engineer, whose name was Kate Russell, dig herself out of the rubble with a broken collarbone and continue fighting. Helen Foster's voice came through the communication system from Council Station, where she was still fighting a different kind of battle, and she said the Galactic Council was calling human tactics reckless and claiming that humans were throwing away lives unnecessarily. Daniel asked his team if that was true, and if they were being reckless with human lives. Claire shook her head and explained that the colonists knew the risks when they signed up, and Earth was still recovering from the environmental collapse of the 21st century, and the colony worlds represented humanity's future, and people were willing to die for that future. Lucas added that the Kryn did not understand human thinking, and he had spoken with one of their military advisors who said Kryn warriors were valuable resources trained for decades, and they could not comprehend sacrificing experienced soldiers for tactical advantages. Daniel studied the star chart and noted the pattern of Jex attacks, and they were systematically testing human defenses and looking for the breaking point that every other species had. He said that the Jex were going to be disappointed because humans did not have a breaking point, and they had 1,000 small fractures that they just kept fighting through. Over the next 3 months, human colonies began implementing what came to be known as fracture tactics, and if traditional military doctrine was designed for durable species that avoided damage, then human tactics embraced their fragility and turned it into an advantage. On mining station, Echo colonists used the low gravity to their advantage, and when Jex raiders attacked the miners who were accustomed to working in environments that would have snapped a Kryn's bones from simple movement, rigged the station's gravity generators to fluctuate wildly, and the attackers in their heavy exoskeletons were thrown into walls and equipment at speeds their armor could not absorb. 12 humans died in the battle, but all 73 Jex raiders were killed, and the ratio sent shockwaves through both human and alien communities. At Agricultural Colony, Harvest, defenders used a different approach, and when long-range sensors detected an incoming Jex fleet, the colonists evacuated their children and elderly to underground shelters and then contaminated their entire water supply with a compound that was harmless to humans, but violently toxic to the Jex's silicon-based biochemistry. The Jex landed and secured the colony, and began using the local water, and within 6 hours their invasion force was incapacitated, and human resistance fighters emerged from hiding and recaptured the colony without firing a shot. 8 humans died in the initial attack, but the Zeks invasion force of 200 was completely neutralized. Helen reported during a strategy session that the Council was horrified, and they were calling human tactics barbaric and asymmetric. Daniel repeated the word asymmetric and tasted it and said, "That was exactly what they were, and you could not fight symmetrically when you were outmatched in every physical category." Helen continued that the Tolmar observers were taking notes, and she thought they were reassessing their position on humanity. Daniel asked about the Kryn, and Helen said they were still dismissive, and Ambassador Kreth claimed that any species that must rely on tricks and traps rather than honorable combat had no place in the Council. Jake laughed bitterly from his station and said that honor was what species with unbreakable bones could afford, and humans had calcium and spite. But the tide was genuinely turning, and human colonies were still getting attacked, but the Zeks were becoming more cautious, and their raids were less frequent and more carefully planned, and they had learned that every human position might be a trap, and that retreat was not in the human vocabulary, and that victory against humans always came at a cost. The breaking point came at a small science outpost called Newton Base, and the Zeks committed a full battle fleet with 5 capital ships and 20 support vessels to what should have been a minor target, and they wanted to make a statement and prove that overwhelming force could break even human resistance. Newton Base had a garrison of 37 people, including scientists and support staff and 6 security personnel. The battle lasted 4 days, and the humans used everything they had, and they vented atmosphere to freeze Zeks boarding parties, and overloaded power generators to create electromagnetic pulses, and fought hand-to-hand in corridors using tools and improvised weapons, and when ammunition ran out, they used mining charges, and when those were gone, they used their fists. By the end, Newton Base was a shattered wreck barely holding pressure, and of the 37 defenders, 11 survived, and 3 of those survivors had injuries that would have killed any other species, including crushed vertebrae and shattered pelvises and punctured lungs. The Zeks fleet withdrew with 2 capital ships destroyed and every remaining vessel damaged. The footage from Newton Base spread throughout the galaxy, and not because the Galactic Council shared it, but because the Zeks did, and they wanted other species to see what they were facing and to understand the threat. It had the opposite effect from what they intended. Species that had dismissed humanity began to reconsider, and the Vesh ambassador requested a private meeting with Helen, and several minor powers reached out to establish diplomatic channels, and even the Kryn fell silent and were no longer so quick with their mockery. In the war room of the Wanderer, now serving as the flagship of humanity's defense fleet, Daniel and his team planned for the next phase. Claire predicted that the Zeks were going to escalate because they could not back down now without losing face, and they would commit to a major assault. Lucas asked where they would attack. Jake highlighted a location on the star chart, which was Haven Colony and humanity's largest colonial settlement, and he said it was symbolic and their biggest population center and most developed infrastructure. And if the Zeks took Haven, they would break human colonial expansion. Daniel nodded slowly and said, "Then they would make Haven the line and show the Zeks and the whole galaxy what happens when you push humans to a place they have decided not to leave." Lucas said they would need everyone and every ship and every soldier and every colonist willing to fight. Claire said with certainty that they would come because that was what humans did, and they showed up for each other even when their bones broke, and even when the odds were impossible, and even when survival seemed unlikely. Daniel looked at his team and at Jake with his cane, and at Claire with her healed arm that still ached, and at Lucas with determination written in every line of his weathered face, and felt something like pride. He ordered them to send the word to all colonies that Haven makes its stand and humanity stands with it. The Zeks fleet emerged from fold space like a swarm of locusts, and 500 vessels strong, they blocked out the stars above Haven Colony, and on the planet's surface 90,000 human colonists looked up at the sky and made a choice, and they stayed. Lucas Grant reported to Captain Daniel Hayes aboard the Wanderer, now in orbit around Haven, that evacuation transports were ready, and they could get the children and elderly and medical patients off-world before the Zeks entered weapons range. Daniel asked how many ships they had for combat, and Lucas answered 14, including the Wanderer, and his voice was flat and emotionless, because they both knew the math, and 14 against 500 was not a battle, it was a massacre. Daniel decided they would need every transport they could spare for evacuation and children, and injured only, and everyone else who could hold a weapon would stay. Lucas reported that the colony administrators were saying most people refused to leave anyway, and Daniel was not surprised because word of the Zhex fleet's approach had reached Haven 6 hours ago, and in that time the colony had transformed into a fortress. On the surface, Jake Patterson stood in what had been a vehicle assembly plant, and was now coordinating the construction of defensive positions, and his leg still ached, but he had thrown away the cane 2 days ago because there was no time for weakness. The colony's chief engineer, whose name was Greg Chen, reported that the underground shelter system could hold about 30,000 people, but they were designed for environmental emergencies, not military defense. Jake replied that they would have to do and told Greg to reinforce the main access points because if the Zhex broke through surface defenses, they would fight room by room underground. Greg said that was a death trap, and Jake said bluntly that everything was a death trap against 500 ships, and the question was how many Zhex they could take with them. In the colony's main hospital, Claire Morrison was organizing triage systems with the local medical staff, and they had 14 doctors and 43 nurses and supplies that would last maybe 3 days of sustained combat casualties. Claire explained to the staff that they needed to prepare for battlefield medicine and forget standard protocols, because they were going to see injuries that would normally require full surgical teams and weeks of recovery time, and their job was to patch people enough that they could keep fighting. A young nurse who was barely out of training raised her hand nervously and asked if that was right, and should they not be trying to save lives instead of sending people back into combat. Claire met her eyes steadily and said they would save more lives by winning than by perfect patient care, and she knew that sounded harsh, but this was the reality of human warfare. In orbit, Daniel assembled the commanders of humanity's tiny fleet, and they appeared as holograms on the Wanderer's bridge, and 14 captains of 14 ships that represented everything humanity could scrape together for Haven's defense. Daniel told them directly that they could not win a conventional engagement, but they did not need to win, and they needed to hurt the Zhex badly enough that they decided Haven was not worth the cost. The captain of the Perseverance, which was a converted cargo hauler with jury-rigged weapons, asked how they could do that with 14 ships. Daniel replied that they would use what they had, and their ships were smaller and more maneuverable, and their crews could withstand higher G-forces than any Zhex pilot, and they were going to use tactics that would kill any other species attempting them. He pulled up a tactical display showing Haven's orbital space, and explained they were going to fight in the planet's gravity well close to the atmosphere, where the Zhex's heavy capital ships would struggle with maneuverability, and they would use the planet itself as cover and as a weapon. Lucas said slowly that Daniel was talking about atmospheric skipping, and at combat speeds with weapons fire, they would lose ships just to navigational errors. Daniel agreed that they probably would, but they would take Zhex ships with them, and every one they took down was one that was not bombing the colony. The Zhex attack began at dawn on Haven's third continent, and their strategy was simple, which was orbital bombardment to break defensive positions, followed by mass landing of ground forces, and they had done it successfully on 100 worlds. They had never done it against humans. The first wave of Zhex ships descended through Haven's upper atmosphere, with their weapons charging for bombardment, and that was when Daniel's fleet struck. The Wanderer dove from high orbit, accelerating at 14 gravities, which was a force that would have liquefied any Kryn pilot, and it skipped off Haven's atmosphere like a stone on water, and its trajectory brought it up directly beneath a Zhex capital ship. The Wanderer fired everything it had, including missiles and railguns and energy weapons, and even its cargo bay's launch mechanism loaded with improvised projectiles, and the Zhex ship's shields flared and held, and then collapsed, and atmosphere vented as the human barrage tore through its hull. Then the Wanderer was gone, diving back toward the planet and using Haven's gravity to slingshot around for another attack run. Across the orbital space, the other 13 human ships executed similar maneuvers, and they darted in and out of the gravity well like angry wasps, taking impossible risks and pulling G-forces that would have killed any other species, and inflicting damage far beyond what their numbers should have allowed. The Zhex fleet, which was designed for the measured warfare of durable species, struggled to adapt, and their targeting systems could not track the erratic human flight patterns, and their heavy ships could not maneuver in the planet's gravity well. Without risking atmospheric entry, and their careful battle formations dissolved into chaos, as human ships appeared from unexpected vectors and fired and vanished. But the Zeks had numbers, and for every successful human attack run, the Zeks countered with overwhelming fire, and the converted freighter Persistence exploded after a kamikaze run that destroyed 2 Zeks destroyers, and the scout ship Ranger disintegrated when its atmospheric skip went wrong and the ship was torn apart by forces that exceeded even human tolerances. On the ground, Zek's dropships began landing, and Jake watched them descend like falling meteors, crashing into cleared zones on the colony's outskirts, and hundreds of them, and each carrying 30 to 40 Zek soldiers in full combat armor. He broadcast to all defensive positions to prepare for ground assault, and reminded them of their training, and said the Zeks were stronger and tougher and better armed, but they expected humans to run and told his people not to. The Zeks advanced on the colony's perimeter, confident in their superiority, because they had fought species across the galaxy, and none had ever withstood a ground assault of this scale. The humans opened fire from entrenched positions, using weapons designed for stopping power rather than precision, and heavy caliber rounds that would have been overkill against most species were necessary to crack Zek's exoskeletons. The Zeks returned fire with energy weapons that burned through human cover and flesh with equal ease, and colonists died in droves and were vaporized or burned or simply torn apart by superior firepower. But they did not retreat, and when defensive positions were overrun, humans fell back to secondary lines, and when those collapsed, they retreated into buildings and fought room by room, and when buildings fell, they disappeared into underground tunnels and emerged behind Zek's lines. In the hospital, Claire worked by the light of emergency lamps because their main power grid had been knocked out by orbital bombardment, and casualties flooded in faster than they could treat them, and there were burns and shrapnel wounds and crushed limbs and compound fractures. A nurse tried to move past a colonist with half his rib cage shattered and said this one was too far gone. Claire snapped that no one was too far gone, and she grabbed a bone fuser and went to work, and her hands were steady despite the building shaking from explosions outside, and she told the nurse that you do not decide when humans quit, and they decide. The man on the table opened his eyes during the procedure, and his name was Paul Mitchell, and he was a farmer who had never held a weapon before 6 hours ago, and he gasped and asked if they held the east perimeter. Claire admitted she did not. No, and Paul tried to sit up despite his shattered ribs and said he needed to get back there. Claire understood what he was asking, and not how long until he was fully recovered, but how long until he could hold a weapon again. She said 2 hours, and she could fuse enough of his ribs to let him move, and it would hurt terribly, and he might die if he took another hit. Paul replied that it was better than dying in the hospital. The battle raged for 3 days and 2 nights, and in orbit, Daniel's fleet was down to 7 ships, and the Wanderer had taken so much damage that half its systems were offline and held together by emergency repairs and sheer stubbornness, but they had destroyed or disabled 43 Zeks vessels. On the ground, the colony's defensive perimeter had collapsed entirely, and the fighting had moved into the streets and into buildings and into the underground tunnels, and humans used every advantage they could find. 3 weeks after the siege of Haven Colony, Captain Daniel Hayes stood once again before the Galactic Council, but this time the atmosphere was completely different, and the chamber was silent, and no mocking laughter echoed through the halls, and no dismissive gestures accompanied his entrance, and the representatives of 43 alien species watched as the human delegation walked to the center of the floor, and what Daniel saw in their eyes was something humanity had never received from the stars, before which was respect and in some cases fear. Ambassador Kreth of the Kryn stood, and his massive silicon form cast shadows across the floor, and Daniel tensed, expecting another dismissal or another lecture about human weakness. Kreth began speaking and said that the Kryn Dominion had reviewed the records of Haven Colony's defense, and his voice was different from the last time they had met, and the mockery was gone and replaced by something that sounded almost like reverence, and he said they had miscalculated. The word hung in the air like a confession, and Kreth continued that they had judged humanity by the strength of bones and failed to account for the strength of conviction, and in 12,000 years of Kryn history, they had never witnessed a defense like Haven Colony, and he said that to fight with such determination despite such catastrophic casualties was something they did not have a word for in their language, and the closest translation would be blessed insanity. A rippling murmur passed through the chamber and several species made sounds of agreement. The Talmar elder, who had previously dismissed humanity, rose from his seat and said that he had lived for 300 years and witnessed the rise and fall of empires and the birth of technologies that reshape worlds, but he had never seen anything like the human species. He gestured and holographic displays appeared throughout the chamber showing footage from Haven Colony, and human defenders fighting with shattered limbs, and Claire Morrison performing surgery under fire, and Jake Patterson coordinating defenses, while barely conscious and a 12-year-old girl dragging her father to safety. The Talmar continued that they had studied human biology extensively, and human bones fracture under stresses that their species would not even notice, and human internal organs are fragile and poorly protected, and human healing is slow compared to the Vesh, and human individual strength is negligible compared to the Kryn. And by every physical metric, humans should not have survived first contact with spacefaring civilization, much less withstand a full Zex assault. He paused and his ancient eyes fixed on Daniel, and he said that yet here, humans stand and battered and broken, but unbowed, and the Zex committed forces to Haven that should have been sufficient to conquer 3 worlds. And they withdrew in defeat, not because humans were stronger, but because humans refused to acknowledge that defeat was possible. Daniel felt Claire shift beside him and her presence was steady, and Jake was there too, walking without his cane now. Though Daniel knew his rebuilt leg still caused constant pain, and Ambassador Helen stood at the front of their delegation with her spine straight despite the exhaustion that lined her face. The Talmar said that the council had come to understand that they had been judging survival by the wrong criteria, and they assumed that durability equaled fitness, and that species with unbreakable bones were destined to inherit the stars, and they forgot that evolution does not reward invincibility, but rewards adaptation, and no species in the galaxy has adapted to adversity the way humans have. A Vesh representative stood and their translucent body pulsed with color, and they said that their species can regenerate limbs and heal wounds that would kill most life forms, and they thought this made them superior survivors, but they watched Claire Morrison treat casualties for 6 days without rest, and watched her save lives that by all logic should have been lost, and they realized that Vesh regeneration is a gift of biology, but human healing is an act of will. Daniel glanced at Claire, who kept her eyes forward, but he saw the tightness around her mouth, and knew the memory of those 6 days would haunt her forever. Kreth announced that the Galactic Council had made a decision, and humanity would be granted full membership status immediately, with all rights and privileges and all access to technology and trade routes, and all protections of council law. Daniel felt a surge of relief, but it was tempered by the cost and 42,000 lives at Haven, and hundreds more in the raids before, and every human who had broken their fragile bones for this moment. The Talmar added that furthermore, the Council formally requested military alliance with humanity, because the Zex threat was larger than they initially understood, and they were expanding aggressively and had proven resistant to traditional council strategies, and they needed commanders who understood asymmetric warfare and who could fight without the luxury of retreat. Lucas Grant spoke for the first time, and his voice carried across the chamber, and he said that the council wanted humans to teach them how to break and how to keep fighting when every instinct says to stop. The Talmar admitted that yes, this was exactly what they wanted, and asked if humanity was willing. Daniel looked at his team and then at Ambassador Helen, and she gave him a slight nod, and he said they would help on one condition, which was that the Galactic Council acknowledges publicly that strength comes in many forms, and that fragility is not the same as weakness, and that survival is measured not by how hard you are to break, but by how you respond when you do break. Kreth said immediately that he agreed, and the records of Haven Colony would be distributed throughout council space, and humanity's story would be known. Over the following months, the galaxy learned what human determination truly meant, and Kryn, warriors who had relied on their unbreakable exoskeletons for millennia, trained with human special forces, and learned that sometimes the best defense was not to avoid injury, but to fight through it. Fesh diplomats who were accustomed to endless patience backed by their regenerative abilities watched human negotiators and learned that sometimes the appearance of desperation could be a weapon, and that showing vulnerability could be a strategic choice rather than a weakness. The Talmar observers compiled a study of human psychology that would become required reading for every council military academy, and it was titled The Paradox of Fragility, and explored how Earth's weakest species became its strongest survivors. Claire Morrison was awarded the Council's highest civilian honor for her work during the siege, and she accepted it with the same steady composure she had shown while performing surgery under fire, and then immediately requested assignment to train Council medical personnel in battlefield medicine. She explained during her acceptance speech that human medical technology was centuries ahead in trauma care, because humans had spent those centuries learning how to put each other back together, and it was a sad expertise, but one they were willing to share. Jake Patterson became an advisor to Council Engineering Corps and taught them how to design systems that could keep functioning, even when damaged. And he told them with a wry smile that human machines break a lot, so they build them to break in. Useful ways, and everything has backup systems and redundancies and ways to limp along when they should not work at all, just like humans. Daniel took command of a joint task force with human ships working alongside Kryn and Vesh and Talmar vessels to push back Zek's expansion, and the humans taught their allies tactics that seemed reckless by Council standards, but proved devastatingly effective. 1 year after Haven Colony, Daniel returned to the rebuilt settlement, and the scars were still visible, with buildings showing signs of repair and memorial stones marking where defenders had fallen. But life had returned, and children played in streets that had run with blood, and farmers worked fields that had been battlegrounds. He found Paul Mitchell's grave in the settlement's memorial garden, and it was marked with a simple stone that said Farmer and Father and Defender, and he held the line. A voice behind him said that Paul never wanted to be a soldier, and Daniel turned to find Paul's daughter, who was the 12-year-old who had dragged her wounded father to safety, and she was 13 now and taller, but her eyes held shadows that should not have been there at her age. She asked Daniel if humans were still weak and if the aliens still thought they were made of glass, and she said she had heard what they used to call humans before. Daniel knelt down to meet her eyes and said honestly that humans were fragile and their bones break and their bodies damage easily, and compared to species like the Kryn, they were physically weak. He gestured to the memorial garden where hundreds of stones marked the fallen, and said that fragile beings had accomplished something remarkable, and held a planet against an invasion that should have swept them aside, not because they were strong, but because they were too stubborn to break the way they were supposed to. The girl said softly that her dad used to say that, and he said humans are like glass and they crack and shatter, but sometimes the broken pieces are sharp enough to cut through anything. On Council Station, Ambassador Helen Foster stood before a gathering of representatives from across the galaxy and new species who had heard of Haven Colony and wanted to understand how humanity had survived. She asked them if they wanted to know the secret and said there was not one, and humans were as fragile as they had heard, and human bones break from falls that would not bruise.